Okay, welcome everybody. We're here today with the union and fire administration representatives to discuss the 4896 policy document. So I think we've all introduced ourselves in the past, so I think we'll just kind of get going. So my name is Ryan O'Hearn. I'm the Assistant Chief of Operations. There you go, there's the non-introduction. So we've had some movement, I think some encouraging ideas since the last meeting. We were able to share a concept last week with some of the members of the Union Executive Board related to psychomotor vigilance testing. We actually have a longer presentation. I felt like the presentation that some of the union members got to see last week, it was abbreviated. The presenter only had 30 minutes, and I don't feel like they got the full effect of the presentation. Scott, you actually had to leave.
Yeah, we had to leave on a call.
Yeah, and so we did do a longer presentation yesterday that I have available if you guys would like to see it, or we can talk about some concepts and ideas first and then see it. Are you guys interested in looking at this psychomotor vigilance testing product that we have found through a company called Pulsar Informatics? They are a Seattle-based company that specializes in fatigue risk management solutions. And I'm pretty intrigued and excited about their product because I feel like it really, excuse me, has a lot of implication for what we're looking at, and I feel like it could be a really good tool for our employees and for the organization. So would you guys like to see it, or would you like to have some dialogue first?
Well, how long is the extended presentation?
It's about an hour. It's 54 minutes, and the last 5 minutes are just kind of some chit chat about importing call data into their system. So I would think that probably about 45 to 50 minutes would be the...
Is it interactive? Can we ask questions?
No, it's a recorded version. But I tried to ask some questions that I thought would be of concern to you guys, so hopefully your questions would be addressed.
I guess, yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting in seeing it. Maybe before we start into it, if you can answer a few questions.
Sure.
That I had, I think a few of us had from the short presentations we got.
Okay.
So my understanding was that this isn't currently being used by any other fire department.
That's correct.
And it hasn't necessarily been, I guess, third-party validated for the fire service. It has been, it looked like they had a bunch of information about like aviation and trucking and some other industries, but have they done any kind of, even in-house research, but I guess preferably third-party, that would validate it for the fire service?
So I asked him that particular question, how he would respond to a question or a concern about whether this is validated for firefighters. On their website, they do mention firefighters as a target audience for their testing. They do not currently work with any fire departments, but they work with, excuse me, I'm going to take a quick drink here. Got a little. They do work with several air medical companies, some of which work a 48-hour shift. And then they're also heavily involved with aviation and petrochemical and trucking. So when I asked the question, I said, how would you respond? And his response is captured in the recorded version.
Okay.
How he would respond to a question of whether it's validated for firefighters. He said basically that firefighters are humans and have the same fatigue stressors as other mission critical workers. And they work in industries that have similar work schedules that we're proposing going to. And so he believes that it does apply to firefighters. So.
I guess, just kind of came up, so they have a couple of air ambulance services, you said?
Yes.
Working 48. Did they have any information about what kind of policies they have in place and how they manage fatigue when they're detected with the program?
They gave some general examples of some countermeasures that they use to combat fatigue, and they talked about kind of a spectrum of policies or mitigation techniques that remain, and they talked a lot about a shared responsibility between the employee and the organization to manage fatigue. And they talked about everything from an employee recognizing fatigue and implementing some individual countermeasures such as some exercise, caffeine. I'm trying to think of some other ones, and then all the way up to some organizational policies that encourage employees to take advantage of opportunities to understand their fatigue and strategically rest, flexing of time, stuff like that. Their program, he didn't present us with like a sample policy that another organization uses, but he referenced them. And what they do is they take a look at your workforce and your schedule, and then they, using their research that they've done with sleep and understanding the general sleep patterns of people, they do some mathematical modeling to predict fatigue, and then they help you craft policies to mitigate that. So,
Okay.
And they did say that they'd also worked with several labor unions in writing the policy too,
Yeah.
so they requested it. So.
yeah,
In where?
They have several, it's in the video, he mentions at least two
Yeah.
labor unions that they've worked with in the past
Yeah,
on developing the policies.
Yeah, they mentioned that they understood the concerns of labor unions and that they have been involved with industries that had organized labor in Australia, the United States, and in Canada. So, and he kind of addresses some of that.
And so, I guess, we don't know what the policy exactly, but did they indicate at all whether they like to develop policies and then use their program as like guidelines for decision making, or do they see their program as being like foolproof, and if you hit a certain number, this is what you do? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I
Like
understand the distinction between the two. One is a guideline and one is like a black and white.
Yeah, like are they proponents of using their technology in a very like hard and fast? This, you hit this number, you must do these things, or is it like employees take the test, then based on their results, there might be some things that you might do depending on the situation. It's very flexible, or are they like a very rigid? If this happens, this happens.
Autumn could speak to this, and maybe if we get to this, you guys would be able to form your own opinion.
Okay.
My sense is that they would be more flexible. And they talked a lot about how their test is not a go, no-go test, that it requires people to be in place to implement policies, to recognize circumstances, and to be able to intervene with the previously identified strategies that we've chosen. And so I don't think that it's a very black and white, no, if you scored a 12 on a test, then you're doing X.
Okay, I get that. My question, go, no go, that kind of.
Yeah, and they talked about stratifications of scoring with the PBT, and I believe 0 to 6, they said that's a low incidence of error on the test, and that is basically there's no need to implement any further strategies. In fact, I think if you're in that category, the test actually recognizes that you're not impaired or not having any attention issues with acuity, and it will actually exit early, I believe. And then I think, was it 6 to 11 or something? There's a mid-range where they said, if people score in this range, that's where you need to look to your people and your policies to say, hey, what's the circumstance? This person's in the kind of yellow zone I'll use. I don't think he used that yellow zone frame, but it gives us an opportunity to recognize that and try to make some decisions, implement some of the things, I think even things that maybe you kind of articulated in your implementation manual. You know, maybe some different strategies that we would use. What are you going to do? Well, we're going to arrest this person now because we're anticipating high call later on, or, you know, we're going to arrest this person now. These other units are going to take call, excuse me, majority of calls. This mask is killing me. And then maybe we'll flip-flop later. So I think that it's flexible.
Okay.
Obviously, there is an upper limit where, you know, I think it's 12, that they say if you score above a 12, you should be concerned and you should intervene and do something with that employee because they are demonstrating a high fatigue state, and that requires intervention. But I don't know that it's a black and white saying you must do X. I think we still have the opportunity to look at our agreed upon policies or kind of that spectrum and say, okay, what makes the most sense to do here?
So I guess from the short presentation that we saw, and that kind of answered some of the questions too, it seemed to me that it was a program that was certainly interesting and could be useful as a decision-making tool, but that it wouldn't be, since it isn't necessarily directly validated for the fire service, it should be making decisions for us, if that makes sense. Just an extra piece of information that we could use to then mitigate the risks of any fatigue. I think that, at least from my point of view, that seems like a reasonable use for something like that, but I don't know about anything that it makes decisions for us.
And I think he does speak to that, saying that, you know, the human component is there, that it's there to alert you when you need to initiate a countermeasure. It does not specifically spell out what you have to do in this instance.
Yeah.
The whole goal of their program is it's a wellness program, and that is to prevent fatigue. And they can interface them with other programs. So, for example, if they knew that, say, one ambulance was taking like 6 calls back to back or something, it may say that, hey, you know, you may want to check this crew to see if they're fatigued, and because maybe they took them too rough enough. And so it's more of a preventative tool. That's the goal, is to keep everybody below the 12 points, so you can initiate a countermeasure before. You can still, and he will speak to that, work when you're tired, but not at a dangerous level. And so I think he addresses a lot of that in his presentation. But again, it was left up to another human being to review it, but the system could actually be predictive in when you're going to have a crew that's starting to face fatigue and you should check on them.
I think that's what we would like to see too, is just, you know, we think it's a great idea. It's a, you know, this is one of the reasons we wanted to go to the 4896 was to address fatigue. And so I think having this, it sounds very reasonable. We want the ability for our captains or our BCs to look at our guys and go, hey, these guys are tired. They're the ones that are closest to the crews that are going to be doing it. And so having their input, I think, is important to us. And so it sounds like that's exactly where this is going.
And I think it relies on the expertise of this company because they can help us craft those interventions. You know, we in the room aren't experts at that, and so we may not know what is going to help this person at this level of fatigue get through this, get past this, or get back to a rested state. But they will help us understand policies and understand sleep at a much deeper level, and fatigue at a much deeper level, not just sleep, so that we can implement those policies. You know, so So I think it's a good resource.
With,
Sounds promising.
with the other, you know, I mean, like you mentioned, life flight air ambulance that work a 48-hour schedule, where were they at as far as frequency of testing? I mean, is it dependent on call volume? Like you just mentioned, 6 calls and you might have to do something, or is it, I mean, a lot of the stuff that he presented the other day kind of made it sound like it was almost like an annual test on some of the different platforms that they used or some of the different jobs. But where does that tie in?
I can't speak to that. He didn't mention a frequency of testing, and my understanding from this place is that they look at the type of work you're doing, they look at your schedule, and they identify triggers for testing, you know, and that could be beginning of shift, end of shift, it could be at some midpoint, but they kind of make the recommendation on the frequency of testing. And so again, you're kind of, you know, they understand the natural sleep rhythms, the circadian rhythms and everything, and they identify points that say, well, this is a period where you may want to look at testing. Obviously, we're not likely to test our people in the middle of emergency response. You know, I don't know what that frequency would look like for us. I'm interested to kind of find out and look, but he didn't mention any frequency as far as a flight service.
Yeah, regarding the flight service, I don't know what that is, because he did not mention that, but he did say that if there were set times, like if you wanted to have them test like at the beginning of the shift, you could say that they've got within an hour of starting shift, they could come in and take that quick test, like when you saw on the NASA app, it's the exact same version. And if you're doing good, it can tell actually in 60 seconds, and it'll quit early. But if it picks up on some delayed responses, it'll make you do the 3-minute test. And if you don't complete it within that hour, it would like notify the captain or the EC that you had one person or 2 people that didn't complete their test. And so you can just call them and say, hey, can you get that done as soon as possible, so that they would have it. You can set up some alerts if you need to, if you decide that you want like a beginning or end kind of shift test.
Well, this is just my opinion. I'm not necessarily speaking for the whole group, but I would anticipate that we'll need to be flexible with something like this over the course of the next year, 2 years, you know, however long, until we get a feel for it and how it works for us. And in this setting where we're making an MOU, would it be possible to build some flexibility into this as it kind of morphs and finds its place? Do you think that's something we can do?
Yeah, and I think that we share that similar concern. You know, I think that there's a very good likelihood that some of the things that we may think on the outset of this are going to be problems are going to turn out not to be problems. And so, you know, in one sense, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to address those problems that then we later on find out, well, that wasn't a problem. And on the other hand, there could be something that we don't anticipate that we're like, okay, now that is something we need to deal with. And I think that having that flexibility to agree on what would the process be if either the union or the city says, hey, we're starting to see a trend in this area and this is concerning to us. You know, how do we come together to address that? What is the process? What are the timelines? What is the, you know, what kind of governs that? And I think that we would very much be interested in just kind of a general approach to how are we going to deal with any process, any, I won't even say problems, but areas of concern that may arise as we transition to this new schedule and as we get a better understanding of how fatigue is affecting our employees. In a general sense, not just due to the 4896, I mean just generally, you know. What do I have you guys like to see that presentation, or do you think you have a good enough understanding of what they offer? I wrote some notes down just about the three different areas that they offer. Would you like me to try to digest it, or do you want to dive in for 45 minutes with this?
Well, we don't, would you have us watch it here, or do you want
Yeah,
us
I
to
would
take?
queue, I've got it
We've
ready
got
to queue up right
want
now.
to watch it.
I think our time would better be served. I don't know. What do you think? I just wondered if, is a presentation, is that what we need to do? Can we not move forward without seeing it, I guess? Or do we have to make a decision on this right now?
Well, I think that this fatigue risk management solution from Pulsar Informatics that we saw, I know that, I believe that right after the last meeting, we presented you with a psychomotor vigilance test that was called Fatigue-O-Meter. And I think some of you may have had an opportunity to try that. They have been a little bit difficult to get information from, and it's my understanding, they're an overseas company. It's my understanding that all they offer is that psychomotor vigilance test, and from there you got to figure it out. And we also have been unable to determine what their pricing model is, and so it's hard for us to even understand whether that's something we could afford or are interested in. Since we gave you access to that, we've kind of had a couple of opportunities to see this process, and we're all pretty excited. And we feel like this fatigue risk management system, it's more than just the PVT, really alleviates, it gives us a tool that maybe alleviates some of the concerns that various people in the city may have over movement to this schedule. So we really feel like this is a big component in getting us a tool to alleviate those concerns. And so we would like some buy-in or some discussion about whether or not you think that this particular program through Pulsar Informatics is viable.
Okay, I'm all for watching it. I think the first thing I would like to talk about, though, is I kind of use the analogy of being a paramedic, and there's a couple of deal breakers that were on the table last time that we need to just make sure, because if we can't solve those, then there's no point in moving forward.
I think we should move forward. I don't think you're going to have any concerns with those two.
Okay, so we're not concerned about a residency requirement, we're not concerned about changing the trade policy?
Nope.
Okay. Let's move on then.
I guess, real quick before we do that, and this might, I have one question and then I guess a thought that could take some time, and since we have a limited amount of time, maybe we want to redirect that way if the group feels like it. But do we have an idea of the financials of these kind of programs, what they are going to cost the department to implement?
We do. This program would be about $15,000 annually to implement.
Annually?
And that would be for staff.
And actually, it might be slightly higher than that, but no more than about 17,000.
And is the,
Depends on how much we want to implement.
I guess, is the city aware that, we expect that we would see some cost decreases with 4096 regarding like maybe sick leave or FLSA overtime, that kind of stuff. A $15,000 increase on the side may offset or maybe even increase costs. So is that something that we're aware of, and I guess wouldn't be held against the schedule when considering the effects of it in the future?
I certainly wouldn't. I think from my impression is that we feel like that is money well spent for a good risk management solution, and for what we're also viewing as something that really could contribute to employee wellness. And he talks a little bit about that, and I have some insight, but I really feel like this could be valuable for our employees, not only because it alleviates a lot of concerns about the 4896, but because I think it gives them information and tools to help understand their own health and wellness. And that's information that the department doesn't have access to.
And so I guess my thought then is that I think from the little bit of discussion we have already had, and then what those of us that saw the presentation saw about it being potentially useful as a decision-making tool, something to help guide us but not make decisions for us. It would be great if out of this meeting we were able to, maybe at least in bullet points on paper, like put down, bringing in some of the points of the fatigue policy that written into the implementation manual, and then maybe how we would implement a PBT program into it. Just maybe have a structure of what this fatigue policy could look like before we leave the meeting today. I think that'd be great. You know, maybe kind of if we could come to an agreement on maybe what kind of strategies we'd want to implement first, as opposed to like a last chain strategy. You know, maybe like having to send somebody home. You know, those kind of things where we want to focus our efforts.
Let's watch this and see if he addresses any of your concerns, and if he doesn't, let's have that conversation, because I kind of feel like he addresses that and gives some examples of some things that they do in other flight services,
Yeah, well,
and other industries that I think are options that would be on the table for us.
okay. Yeah, let's watch it. I just maybe afterwards, if we all have that in mind while we're watching this too, if we could start building that policy. Even if it's not the final result, get some bullet points on it, even just notepads, and have something we can all leave here today and be like, yeah, this is where we're headed. This is kind of what we want.
Okay.
That sound all right?
Well, thanks a lot.
I'm gonna move around.
Yeah, I might go.
All right, Matt, I think we're ready to get started. Thank you so much for joining us again today.
Certainly. Good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Van Wallen, and I'll be guiding you through an explanation of how you can approach fatigue risk management with some proven technologies that we've been working with many operators in many different industries with over the past decade. So if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt, or if there's a more in-depth question, I'm also available following the slides, which will only take about 20 minutes, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. So who is Pulsar? We've been around 20 years. I'm the senior project manager at the company. I'm also one of the founders. We've worked a lot with many different government agencies in refining and developing the science of fatigue and performance. In particular, we've worked a lot with the FAA and the US Department of Transportation, in both cases helping shape guidance documents to industry, also performing studies of fatigue in actual operations. So we monitored, for example, with the FMCSA, we monitored over 250 truck drivers for a 6-month period and reported back to a congressionally mandated study on driver fatigue. With the FAA, we have a contract to look at helicopter incidents and evaluate the degree to which fatigue is a causal factor. I should also mention, because I understand there's some labor representatives on this call, we have worked extensively with organized labor groups in both Australia and Canada, and also in the United States. In particular here, we've supported the NetJets Pilots Association with conducting a fatigue study. So we have a strong relationship with labor groups, and we understand their viewpoints, and we find that what we do fits nicely with their goals of increasing worker safety. Our products are available on multiple platforms, and what we've really done is taking what the science has perfected and developed and brought it to the operational field. So, speaking of the science, just a few slides to give everyone sort of level set on what is fatigue. The fatigue is a state where you are not performing safely or reliably at a given task. And that's a very general statement. We often associate fatigue with sleepiness, but you can be sleepy without being fatigued and vice versa. The three drivers of fatigue in operations are sleep debt, time of day, and long days. And I'm going to speak about each of these in turn. So sleep debt is a real thing. If you deprive yourself of sleep day after day, you will build up a sleep debt. And this picture is a study that was done back in 2003. We actually supported this study. In the study, 4 groups, it was divided, volunteers were divided into 4 groups, each of which is represented by a colored line. And as you can see here, 8 hours, 6 hours, 4 hours, that indicates the amount of hours each group was given in bed per day. So this 8-hour group, they had a full 8 hours of time in bed each night. Then there was a 6-hour group, a 4-hour group, and these poor folks were completely sleep deprived for 3 days straight. And in this picture, up is bad, and I'll explain what this PBT score is on another slide coming up. But what you want to look at here is that each of these curving lines is upward sloping, which means that as the sleep debt builds, as you move to the right in time, your performance degrades. So your performance on a wake state stability task, think of any decision-making or executive function that you need to do in your job, you become more and more impaired with growing sleep debt. And especially the 6-hour group, it's worth pointing out that after 9 days, they were performing just as badly as the people who had pulled an all-nighter. So that's something to think about. Time of day, this is pretty straightforward and intuitive. We are not programmed to be working at night. We are programmed to be sleeping at night. We are not owls or mice. We are a daytime species. And so it is a significant fatigue stressor if we're expected to be working and on duty during nighttime hours. This doesn't mean that we cannot work at night. Obviously, it happens all the time. And in your organization, you have 24-hour shifts and even 48-hour shifts. And the point is that being aware of this fatigue stressor is important because you need to manage and mitigate this fatigue stressor in order to safely and reliably perform your work duties during the nighttime hours. Long days is another fatigue stressor. So all of us are pretty good for about 16 hours of continuous wakefulness. So think about waking up at 6 a.m. and 6 plus 16 is 22. So around 10 p.m., your body's starting to shut down for the night. You're wanting to go to sleep. Those of us who have to stay up longer will start to feel more and more impaired. And if you stay up for 17 hours, studies have shown that your impairment is comparable to that of someone who has a 0.04 blood alcohol level. If you stay up for 22 hours, you are as impaired as somebody who has a blood alcohol content of 0.08. So that's another helpful way of thinking about long days in terms of the effect of alcohol, which is familiar to us. And again, the reason we point out long days as a fatigue stressor, not only because the science says it is, but also because it happens in operations. In your department, if you have a particularly busy day with multiple transports or multiple calls, your crews could be awake continuously for more than 16 hours on a given shift. Okay, so comprehensive fatigue risk management. To introduce this approach we're taking, I'll start with a famous model of risk called the Swiss cheese model. In this model, the red arrows represent the progression of a hazard into a consequence. So think of driving. If the hazard is an icy road, then that consequence that may result from that icy road is a collision. Each slice of cheese is a barrier to that consequence occurring. It's intended to stop the consequence. And you can see this sort of stylized upper arrow got bounced off the third slice of cheese, which means that Even though the first 2 barriers failed, the third one was successful in preventing the consequence from occurring. The idea being that no barrier is foolproof, they're porous, and you have to have multiple barriers to reliably have a robust risk management system. The modern representation of a risk model is known as a bow tie model. And I'll show you a picture of a bow tie on the next slide. This is a zoomed in picture of an actual bow tie for a commercial airline that we support. In this model, the hazard is on the left and the consequences will be way off to the right, past this orange sun-like center knot. And the progression from hazard to consequence follows this line here. And these sideways hockey pucks are the barriers. So previously we had slices of cheese, now we have these sort of sideways hockey pucks. And the idea again is that you have to have multiple barriers to prevent the hazardous condition from continuing on and becoming a consequence. So here's the full picture that we use to represent what we do. So this is the center knot. It's known as the high-risk state in a bow tie model, and it is a fatigued employee performing a safety-sensitive or mission-critical task. Note, just being fatigued on its own is not a high-risk state. You're welcome to be fatigued after a long day when you get home and start to relax on the couch. You're welcome to be fatigued, and you're expected, it's very likely you're going to be fatigued if you're fighting wildfires and you're taking a 20-minute break at the base. But the issue is being fatigued while on duty. That's important. It's a distinction that's important. And the reason this is called a bow tie is you can sort of see the left-hand side looks like one of the wings of a bow tie. The right-hand side typically also looks like a wing. We tremendously simplify it just to a list of consequences, and we don't insert any barriers here, whereas normally there would be barriers here. The reason is we don't serve this particular side of the picture. This side of the picture is the domain of automation. So again, if your hazard is an icy road and your consequence is a collision, if you are already slipping and sliding on that road, you're in that high-risk state, you've lost control of your vehicle, traction control, automatic traction control will be one of the barriers that prevents a collision. And so we don't build any automated systems, and so that's why we don't represent any barriers in this particular part of the picture. What we do actually is all of our business is on this left-hand side. So our job as a fatigue risk management services provider is to implement reliable, effective barriers to common fatigue hazards so they don't manifest into this high-risk state in the first place. And I'm now going to go through each of these barriers in turn. The first one is, I actually don't have a slide on it, so let me go back and talk about it here. This is a consulting service. We build a fatigue risk management system. That's what the S stands for. And basically, we work with a template that we've developed over a number of years, which is essentially like a handbook or a manual. And it covers important policies and procedures that should be followed in order to effectively manage fatigue risk. And I'll give you an example. Non-punitive reporting, that's a big one. If you see something, say something. We want to encourage your workforce to be attentive to signs and symptoms of fatigue among their colleagues and even in themselves, and put up their hand if they see something, and put up their hand if they feel themselves to be fatigued enough that they feel that they're not being safe. It's very important that you have a policy to encourage reporting on behavior by making it explicit that people that report are not going to get punished for doing so. They're not going to lose pay, they're not going to get fired, they're not going to get a poor performance review. It's a nuanced policy, obviously, because you want to be careful that you're not giving people just an easy pass to go home if they feel a little bit tired. So it takes some careful wording, but the idea is that this is where good policies are effective, and effective procedures, well communicated to the staff, become an effective barrier. The three tools that follow, the three next barriers, are fatigue meter, PVT work fit, and countermeasure. And my understanding is that your department initially contacted us primarily because of an interest in an objective assay of alertness, which is what PVT is. So I'm going to start by talking about that. This is the login screen on an iPad for the product called PVT WorkFit. PVT WorkFit is intended to capture sources of fatigue that are not related to the schedule. So this is biological factors and behavioral factors. We like to think of the cognitive impairment causes as the 4 Bs. I've talked a lot about sleep, that's captured in the third B, but also the effects of alcohol, the effect of recreational or over-the-counter medications here on the left, and the effects of medical conditions such as sleep apnea may contribute to impaired alertness and cognitive impairment. PVT stands for Psychomotor Vigilance Test. It's a 3-minute boring video game that's delivered on an iPad or iPhone. It is powerful because it is sensitive to all these Ds that I've mentioned, and it has no learning effect. This is very important. You can't get better at this test if you've done it 100 or 1,000 times. It's a very simple neurological process that's being measured, much like when you go to the doctor and they tap your patella tendon to check your reflexes under the knee, and they watch the motion of your leg. That's something you can't control. It's involuntary. In a similar way, what's being tested here is a very similar involuntary neurological process. It was invented in 1985 by Dr. David Dinges of the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. My colleague, who was the CEO of our company, he completed his PhD working under Dr. Dinges. And we spent the better part of a decade and a half refining this PVT technology and making it available on a number of different hardware devices. And to this day, Dr. Dinges will only recommend our PVT to those who ask him which one to use. Here's just a handful of studies that have been done validating the PVT. It's the alertness measure to which all other alertness measures are compared or benchmarked. It really is the world's gold standard. So how do you take a PVT? It's a very simple testing process. You watch the screen, which looks like this. At random intervals of time, ranging from 1 to 4 seconds, the box will turn yellow, and numbers will start counting up in milliseconds. When you see that happen, you simply have to tap the screen. That's it. And then the process repeats. You don't have to tap inside the box. You can tap anywhere on the entire surface of the screen. And if you tap too soon, that is before the numbers have started counting, you will see this picture on the right. It'll say false start. And this is a timing diagram. So progressing from left to right is time. Starting at 0 milliseconds is where the numbers start counting and the box turns yellow. If you tap the screen within 100 to 355 milliseconds, that's considered a valid response. That is, your wake state stability is sharp enough that you have reacted to the visual stimulus and tapped the screen within the window that you're expected to do so as an alert person. If you tap after 355 milliseconds, let's say half a second or more, you experience what's called a lapse. Now, why does this happen? The fatigued brain tends to have effects called microsleeps. And again, we're talking here about significant fatigue impairment. We're not talking about feeling a little bit tired. A microsleep is where your eyes are still open, but your brain has shut down for a very short window of time. That's what's being tested here. That's what we're looking for in these lapses. Similarly, If you tap too soon, you get a false start. And this is an impulsive response, which is also characteristic of an impaired state. Studies have shown that people who are impaired due to fatigue tend to take shortcuts, tend to try to get the task done sooner, to think about getting to bed sooner. So a false start behavior, it increases with impairment. So what happens with these lapses and false starts? Well, we simply add them up. That becomes the total error score. And pictured on the left here is an example of the feedback that we provide to the person taking the test after it's completed. This is just one example. We also have alternate screens which present a large word such as passed or caution. So that's another option. We place the result in one of three buckets. 0 to 7 means you're fine, you're alert enough to safely go back to work. Basically, from a fatigue risk management perspective, we don't care about you, you're fine. 8 to 11 is known as the intermediate or transitional zone. This is where some people will start to show signs of impairment due to fatigue. 12 plus is known as the elevated fatigue risk zone. And here is where we would not recommend somebody scoring 12 or higher to drive a vehicle or operate machinery or fly an aircraft. Studies have shown that people that are scoring 12 and above are truly at risk of performing errors of commission or errors of omission. And by the way, an error of omission, we can think of it as a lapse. An error of commission would be a false start. It's pretty harmless to have errors on the PBT, but if you're flying a plane or driving an ambulance, those kinds of errors can be very costly or even cause injury. Here's a picture of a case study of the use of the PBT in a community of panel operators at ExxonMobil. These are folks, much like Homer Simpson, that are in charge of a panel of winking lights. It's not a nuclear facility, it's a petrochemical refinery, but it's just as safety sensitive in that if they don't pay attention and one of the lights is blinking, indicating that a valve is over pressure, there's a significant danger of the plant having an explosion. And this has happened. I can't remember exactly the date, but there was a case where a fatigue panel operator didn't pay attention and the plant had an explosion causing multiple fatalities. And I think this was in the 1980s in Texas. So here we see most of the 97 workers that we tested in this pilot project came in at the 0 to 7 and a few were in the intermediate zone. But there was 3 outliers, and this is very significant. This is literally off the chart. We normally see just a handful of scores in the neighborhood of 14, 15, 16, but here we saw these 3 individuals testing way outside even that high elevated fatigue risk level. Upon further scrutiny, because we flagged these results to the occupational health group, and they had these people tested with their personal doctors, and they went in for a full physical. And it turned out that this one had a blocked coronary artery that he had not been aware of. These were 3 men. And this person had sleep apnea that was not being treated. They had a CPAP device but weren't using it. And this person was experiencing some kind of a life crisis in their family and wasn't sleeping at night as much as, he had the opportunity to sleep. So he would go to bed on time, but he would lay awake tossing and turning for 4 hours. So each of these, the good news is that each of these 3 were diagnosed with their conditions or received treatment, and within 2 to 3 months were back at work, testing within the normal range on the PBT. So it was definitely a success story, and we've continued to support ExxonMobil with this group of safety-sensitive employees ever since. The second tool that I'll just touch on briefly is Fatigue Meter. I've talked a lot about assessments and monitoring fatigue risk that's not driven by your schedule. So again, alertness, being alert for duty, biological and behavioral factors. We've talked about how you may be not sleeping well, or you may have a medical condition. There's other reasons you could
Can
be.
you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Hey, this is Chief King. Hey, just so you know, I think we're pretty much interested in all of your whole package, so please don't shorten it up. I mean, the PBT was our initial,
Right.
only because we were looking specifically for something, but I think at this point, we're pretty interested in all of it, so please give us the full meal deal as if we're looking for all of it.
Okay, thank you, Chief Gates. I'll do so. Yep. I wanted to just then back up to this picture. So we've talked about PBT work fit, which is the barrier to not being alert for duty. And the other thing I want to mention here is the reasons you may not be fit for duty could be perfectly valid. You may have a young child at home, a baby. You may have an elderly family member that needs help and you're staying up late with them. You may have a second job. You may be taking night school. You may be renovating your kitchen. All of these are perfectly reasonable, often permissible activities that occur in our private time. Nevertheless, if they cut into your sleep, they will contribute to an alertness deficit, and that's where PBT comes in, PBT work fit comes in. And this also ties into the first barrier in terms of policies and procedures. One of the things we lay out in our fatigue risk management program manual is a statement of shared responsibility. What is that? It says that the organization has a responsibility for fatigue risk management and the individual has a responsibility for fatigue risk management. It is the organization's responsibility to create schedules and provide opportunities for rest in those schedules to prevent workers from becoming unduly fatigued. It is the individual's responsibility to use their time off to obtain restorative sleep that they need to show up fit for duty the next day. And you can see the interplay there. The middle barrier here, fatigue meter, which I'll talk about next, talks about schedules. So this is where the organization comes in. So we've talked a lot about how working at night can be fatigue stressor, working long hours can be fatigue stressor. So how do you make sure that the schedule you're giving your workers is not creating those fatigue stressors to an extent that will drive impairment? So I'm going to fast forward now to the beginning of fatigue meter. Okay, so fatigue meter, just to look at it quickly as a picture, it looks like this. You have your employees listed, and the color coding, again, is just like when we saw the color coding before, where I guess the red is used to indicate elevated fatigue risk, orange is transitional, and the gray is low fatigue risk. This dotted rectangle indicates I believe, a period of overtime, but I'm not sure about that. The point is that at a glance, and the blue vertical line here would be what we call the now line. This is literally, it would be this moment in time. This is a screenshot taken at just after 5 a.m. And you can see that the individuals that are currently in a high fatigue state are Steve, Gerardo, Andy, Jeremy, and Eric, and perhaps Chris down here. You can also see that this person, Richard, is going to be in a fatigue state in a couple hours. This is critical. What does this mean? It means that you can actually contact Richard and say, hey, we're looking at your schedule here, and it looks like you're coming up to a high fatigue a couple of hours later this morning. Let's talk about your plan for that. Are you going to have a nap? Or do you want to have a cup of coffee if you're a coffee drinker? Are you going to do a few jumping jacks and maybe go for a short walk to help elevate your heart rate? I'm touching on a number of different activities that you can do to mitigate fatigue risk. I don't want to gloss over them. Broadly speaking, they fall into two categories. One is known as personal countermeasures, and the other is known as risk controls. Coffee is a personal countermeasure. Not everyone drinks coffee. People have multiple, or wide range of sensitivities to caffeine. And so it needs to be used strategically and based on the individual's own preferences. It cannot be dictated by the organization. unlike a personal countermeasure, a risk control can be imposed or implemented by the organization. For example, Richard, we'd like you to take a 40-minute nap. You're off duty for 40 minutes, please. And that's there's a base at which Richard is located, and there's a rest room, and he'll go in there and have a 40 or 20 or 40-minute nap. And coming out of that nap, presumably this red box will no longer be red, but perhaps be orange. The other thing that I want to point out right at the outset here is you don't have to be staring at this screen the entire day if you're a safety manager. You will get alerts when your employees are entering a high fatigue range. So you only need to be responding to any alerts you're getting. And those alerts are not going to be coming at you 10 a minute. This screen is showing you a lot of high fatigue workers, but this is probably from an organization that has 500 or 1,000 employees. So this is not every person, every shift. That's the other thing I'd like to quickly point out. I can skip this slide. Here's a picture of what the notifications will look like. So on the left, this is it's either an assessment that was failed or a high-risk state is about to start for this individual. In this particular picture, it's showing a failed assessment. Failed is a strong word. Some organizations prefer to use alert just by itself. What this is saying is that the PBT test that was taken ended up in a score of 12 or higher. Alternatively, you could have survey questions delivered together with the PBT, such as, did you get enough sleep last night? Yes or no? And if the person answers no, that would also trigger this kind of an alert. And on the right is a picture of what we call a compliance alert. If a staff member was expected to complete an assessment at a given time coincident with starting work, then failed to do that assessment or forgot to take that assessment, then this kind of an alert would be generated to the safety manager. Let's see, I wanted to say a few more words about the fatigue model. I don't have that slide in this presentation, but to give you a sense of how do we know when this is supposed to be red and when this is supposed to be orange, how do we know that? So what's going on in the background here? We are connected to your scheduling system. So fatigue meter needs to be connected to your scheduling system. That is, we need to know when Steve Deacon starts work and when he finishes work. We need to know his schedule. We plug that schedule into a biomathematical model. This is a validated scientific representation of when people sleep given a chance to be off duty. That is, if I'm a 9 to 5 worker, this model will predict that I'm sleeping between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. That is an 8-hour period, which is the population average, and it occurs straddling the nighttime period. That's the sort of obvious, intuitive answer. But if I'm a shift worker and I work during the night and I sleep during the day, when am I sleeping? That's not so easy to answer. And that's where science comes in, and many studies that have been done, the data from those studies have refined this mathematical model of sleep and fatigue. And that model is what estimates when a person will be sleeping when they're off duty. The next thing we do is we plug the sleep period into another biomathematical model that estimates and predicts fatigue level using predictive analytics for every hour on duty over the day coming and the following day and the day after that. It's remarkable that it's 90% accurate. So if you give me your work schedule for a week-long period and I plug that into our models, it'll predict not only when you're sleeping over that course of the week, but where your fatigue maxima and minima are. So let's think of it this way. If you're just a 9 to 5 worker, all of us are familiar with that sort of afternoon lull just after lunch where you have a little bit of drowsiness. There's a second minimum during the day, and that occurs while you're hopefully sleeping at 5 a.m. That's a very pronounced circadian low, it's called. So those are the two minima. We also have two maxima during a 24-hour day. One of them occurs around 6 p.m. and the other one occurs late morning, like 9, 10 a.m. And so our bodies, just like our core body temperature varies a little bit throughout the day, our alertness naturally varies throughout the day. And these biomathematical models that we use basically they use that phenomenon that science has discovered to calculate when these people are expected to be in an elevated fatigue state. So that's where we get the colors. And then you can drill down and you can click through and see exactly what the typical range of a given worker is, because we're all different. And so this range will be based on historical data for this worker's schedule. And it'll also give you a number about today's expected peak. So the red color doesn't tell you how high that fatigue is. So you can click, in this case Richard was clicked, and you can read off to the right. And you can also generate a report, look at further details.
Hey, Matt?
Yes.
I have a question real quick. So, we've talked to you that we're planning on going to the 4896, so 48 hours. How would we incorporate with you? Because obviously, in our 48-hour schedule, they have the ability to sleep, but then the call is what wakes them up in the middle of the night. Is there going to be a way that we can kind of track real time or somehow feed that into your model so that, we can say, okay, well, they were on a call for X amount of time? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and you're right to ask it. The model that's currently being used to drive, I would call natural estimates of fatigue, assumes that if you're off duty, you have a chance to sleep, and if you're on duty, you do not sleep. But that's actually not the case in your operation. We've already picked up on this with our customers in air medical transport, and we're actually doing a data collection study right now with PHI down in Arizona, looking at exactly that question. That is, what happens if there's one transport call that comes in during the off-duty time, or during the on-duty time? I'm sorry. What if there's two transport calls?
Will we get a discount as we are part of your model to figure out how to incorporate that better so you can sell to all the other fire departments?
You know what? That's a very good question. I'll take that away and share that question with my team and get back to you.
Awesome.
Okay, so that's a valid point, and we're on it. Is the short answer. Okay, so here's just another case study to share for those of you who haven't seen it. This is a trucking operation based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where we implemented fatigue meter back in 2016, August, and they saw a reduction in hard braking events of 60% over the course of the next year, and they're still down here averaging less than 10 a month. So it's a phenomenal outcome that we were even surprised by, how alerting the safety manager to the presence of fatigue risk in the schedule and taking an active step by calling the driver and saying, look, Jim, looks like you're going to be fatigued later today. And again, I'm not talking about right now, I'm talking about in advance. We're calling them out in advance. They have a chance there to take steps to mitigate that upcoming fatigue. And this definitely, as you can see in the data here, it really does drive results. The third tool is Countermeasure. So we've talked about schedule-based sources of risk. We've talked about individual biological behavioral sources of alertness impairment. Countermeasure has two goals. It's to really bring this down to the individual level. The fatigue meter works on population averages. BBT works on, it's a spot test of exactly what your fatigue level is right now. But how do I plan if I'm an individual and I have a shift over the next 10 days that has some night work, some day work? How do I look at what I'm expected to feel? So Countermeasure, I'll start with the second question. So this is the screen. It's an individual app that will show you your schedule, will show you your fatigue highs and lows. So here up is bad. This person, as you can see, is going to be in the red, so to speak, on Tuesday afternoon. And you can see, you can look ahead in your schedule. Here at the top, you can see there's my schedule for 10 days. And I can see that yesterday and today are my peaks, and I'm going to be fine for the next 5 days. We say flights here because this was originally conceived for pilots, but it works just as well for any worker that really wants to track their own schedule. It'll also show you your PBT scores over the last month or 6 months. And you can see, where your scores today. If you scored a 6 today, you can see, oh yeah, that's pretty good, because normally I was scoring some 7s and even 8s and 9s. Whereas if you scored an 11, you would say to yourself, wow, that's at the upper end of my normal range. I should be careful today. That seems to indicate that I'm fatigue impaired right now. So giving the data back to the individual employee is the goal of this particular app. The second thing Countermeasure does is it provides training. Training is the fourth barrier in terms of a comprehensive approach to fatigue risk management. You want your staff to understand the signs and symptoms of fatigue. You want them to be aware of the fatigue stressors that I've talked a little bit about today. And you want them to know what they can do about it. What are the countermeasures? What are the risk controls? How do they work? When are they implemented? This is the kind of things that are covered in our training. And this is delivered as a multimedia video with voiceover, and it's divided into 5 to 7 minute modules. Here it says 60 minutes. That's not correct. I'm going to have to fix that. Each of these modules is about 7 minutes long, so it's intended to be easy to consume. And then we follow it up with there's a quiz at the end to make sure that the person has retained the knowledge, and then we obviously track the quiz's completion rates and scores. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to share with you in terms of pictures and slides. I think it's a great opportunity to entertain any questions you may have. I'll go back to the main picture.
Hey Matt, would you mind showing the part where you showed how you could move the nap period?
Sure.
I think that was, could you show that real quick?
Certainly. Yeah, let me pull that up. So Chief Gates is asking if I could show how fatigue meter works in real time. So I'm going to open it up here in my browser window. This is the aviation fatigue meter that I have access to. Workforce fatigue meter works very much the same. It's just for, this one has some extra features for pilots because they take flights.
So with that concept of they take flights in there, would that be some way that you could easily adapt it for they take a call?
That's right. That would be exactly correct. Yeah.
If you use the call, they would have to put in when they went on the call type of thing or something like that.
Yeah. So you're right to think in that direction. That's exactly how we would characterize it. So here, just for orientation, the big blue rectangle. So this is a time scale left to right, and we're looking at a period of 3 days. So I'll just drag it left and right so you can see we're looking at the 23rd, 24th, and 25th of July here. And the big blue rectangle is a duty period. The dark rectangle at the top, this would be a flight taken by this crew, and this is from San Diego to Pisa, Italy. And I'm going to put it on manual sleep. So right now it's automatically calculating that if this pilot was on duty for 6 hours from takeoff to cruise, and then they were on duty again for 2 hours from top of descent to landing, they would have this time off in between, during which the model is predicting they would get 2 hours of sleep. If I put it on manual, what I can do is I can delete that sleep, and you'll see the curvy line balloons way up here. And this is the fatigue scale and the same units as the PBT. So we're looking at a fatigue level of close to 16. way up here. Now he's off duty by this time. This is way after landing, but as you can see, during landing, unmitigated, that is without any rest period, this particular worker would have been at about a 12. And I can actually click this blue bar and it'll tell me it's 11.4 maximum fatigue. We would consider that to be a little bit high. It's not yet 12, but it's certainly worth mitigating. And so in this case, we would drag and drop a sleep period, and maybe we'll just give him an hour. And you can see right there that drop his fatigue from 11.4 down to 8.6. So that sleep has a powerful positive effect in restoring alert function. This little squiggle that you see here, this is called sleep latency. It's that grogginess you feel when you just wake up. And so the fatigue is a little bit elevated immediately after waking, but it dissipates within 20 to 30 minutes. And other things that this particular tool can do, you can move the flight and duty periods earlier in time and see what effect that has. As you can see here, that's an even lower fatigue level rather, because he's now taking off in the morning and he's landing less into his own natural nighttime. There's this, the period between midnight and 6 a.m. in the science is known as the window of circadian low, often called the WOCL, W-O-C-L. Moving this whole operation left moved me out of that WOCL more than I was before. You can just see from the picture that this person's WOCL probably occurs around here where that big hump is. And so this is the tool that we use with Air Canada right now. United Airlines uses this kind of modeling approach. They're not our customer, but they are a customer for the PDT. This modeling is also used by Emirates Airlines, which is our biggest customer. They pass their entire schedule and they look at it in these pictures to determine whether the fatigue levels are acceptable. And so they'll set a an upper bound. They'll say, we don't want any 11s, so everyone has to be less than 11. If there's an 11, we need to do something. We need to move the flight left or right, or we need to have augmented crew. We need to have more pilots so that they can take shifts while they're operating the aircraft. So hopefully that gives you a window into how these models are working in the background.
Thanks, Matt. That was what I wanted to see.
Sure. So yeah, that was the barriers discussion. I shared with you the consulting that we do to build the FRMS in a box, which is a manual of policies and procedures and workloads. We talked about PDT WorkFit. We talked about fatigue meter, and we talked about countermeasure.
So Matt, quick question. So all of our calls are in a computer system, and I think, from my perspective, in an ideal world, I would like to see our database, our call database, being more or less exported into your system. So the, kind of like the flight, so that, the time the call occurs and the time that they're back in service is kind of couched as like that flight. Does that make sense?
It does, yep.
And so that's kind of what I'm hoping we can get, because I certainly don't want our guys, when their sleep is important as it is, I don't want them to have to go in and say, okay, here I'm logging my call, when that's already technically being done.
Correct.
So if we develop that, I think that would be pretty handy.
Definitely, yeah. We definitely don't want to have any manual data entry. People are allergic to data entry. We don't expect it. So we would definitely look to integrate through an application programming interface, shortened to API. That's commonly what's done. What is the scheduling system that you use in which you track your calls?
The current one is emergency reporting systems.
Okay. I'm just writing that down.
And we can certainly, show you that and we can figure out what the data would look like. Just for refresher, $5 per person for the PVT, fatiguometer and countermeasures, and then the FRMS actually comes as kind of part of that whole package.
Yes, that's correct, yeah. Yeah, we don't charge for the first barrier if you purchase the other three, and they are indeed $5 per person per month.
I have a couple of
Anybody else?
questions, Matthew. Yeah, I have a couple.
Please.
Go ahead.
So I have two. Matthew, how would you respond? I know you said this is for mission critical workers, but you're not currently doing any firefighters. How would you respond to a question about whether or not this is validated for firefighters?
Okay. My perspective would be that firefighters are humans just like you and I, and they suffer from the same fatigue stressors that others do. And so whether or not it's validated comes down to, is their work schedule similar to that of other, individuals that work nights or work long hours? And the answer to that is yes. We've consistently seen, and that's why we don't just serve one industry. We're very active in trucking, we're very active in air medical transport. I mentioned petrochemical refining. We're doing very large studies right now with utility operators, one in Italy, another one in the southern US. So all of these different domains, the recurring theme is it's either the fatigue stressor is driven by the schedule, or it's driven by people that are not alert when they're expected to be. And those are the things that we're looking for with our tools. Indeed, every workforce is unique, every operation is unique, but fundamentally, the drivers of fatigue are the same across the board.
Okay, thanks for that. And then second question is on countermeasure. You talked about personalized insights where people can kind of go in and track their own schedule and maybe even link it to a wearable device. Does the organization have access to that same personalized information?
That's an excellent question, and I failed to explain that. The answer is no. People don't want to share their individual sleep data. And so we have recognized that. In fact, we were one of the first groups to build a watch that monitors sleep. We did this for the US Navy. This was the year just before Fitbit came out. And we realized from our work with the Navy groups that people are okay wearing these things now and then, but they really don't want to share the data back with their employer. And so what we do is we say, look, we can support the actual sleep period data coming off your device if you want, and it'll help calibrate your fatigue scores, your estimated fatigue based on the biomathematical models, because it'll no longer be based on population averages of sleep, it'll be based on your actual sleep. But we're not going to give that data to your employer because it's none of their business. That's the whole point of Countermeasure. It's to give the individual employee more accurate data about their own sleep and wake behavior, and we don't need to be sharing that with the employer. The only thing the employer will get is the PVT score results and the assessment results, because that is, it's documented in the policy handbook, it's communicated through training, and it sets the expectation. It backs up the policy that employees are expected to be fit for duty when they show up for work.
Thanks for clearing that up. I know that that might be one concern that an employee would have, so thank you.
Absolutely, yes.
I think those are the only questions that I had.
Okay, Chief Gates, I thought you had something to add there.
Actually, I think that was it. I think we've got that all. I really appreciate your time. Looks like it's a pretty dynamic program, so.
Thank you. Yes, happy to help, and I'll be certainly available by email for any follow-up questions as you guys chew on the information you received today.
All right, thanks for sitting through that, guys.
Just a reminder, we have to be out of here right at 4, because we've got a second meeting
Okay,
behind us.
thanks for that. So what's your initial thoughts on that? Do you think that's something that would be acceptable for us to use moving forward?
I have a couple questions
Sure.
about that, Ryan. So like when they were doing the sleep debt study and they had the people that slept 0 and then 4 and 6 and 8, how come if 7 and 9 is the recommended amount, the 8 ended up increasing over time? Because it would seem like that falls right within the recommended sleep. And so that should more or less be a flat line. Why would that be increasing over time? And does that affect the result of that study?
He actually answered that in our first one when we first looked at it. And the reason was because our human population, the range changes for each person, and it's usually between 6 to 9 hours, but could be up to 10 hours based on the individual. So if they were only getting 8, they could still accumulate a deficit, and that's why that would start to show that even the ones that were getting 8 hours, certain individuals within that group, and I can't remember how many he said were in each group, could actually require like 9 to 10 hours of sleep to maintain the same alertness, because it depended on the individual.
Now that you say that, there is a point that he brought up in our first presentation that he didn't go over in this that I thought was interesting, and it was along the same lines as that individualized sleep requirements. And it was that certain people are better at working in that different time of day. You know, so Shane may be more adept than I am at working at night. Intuitively, I thought, well, all of that figures into this fatigue meter, and it could allow the organization an opportunity to say, well, we understand that Shane and Scott are night owls and they do better managing fatigue at night than Ryan and Andy do. And so we may use that in some manner. I'm not suggesting that we will, but it could be an additional decision-making tool for us to say, well, we're going to do this with Andy and Ryan right now in order to help mitigate some of this. And we're going to do, you know, I just thought it was interesting that he pointed out that not only do different people need different sleep levels, but that they do better based on time of day. And so it's not just categorically across the board, everybody needs 8 hours and they must sleep between 11 and 7. So I thought it was interesting that they had drilled down to that level.
Would the test scores alone enable you to make that decision though?
I don't know.
I mean, because, well, I mean, I had the same question that you asked there at the end. But, I mean, obviously he answered you about the personal data and stuff like that. But, I mean, if the organization's only getting test scores, then that, you know, I mean, that seems like a small aspect of this to be able to try to do something like what you just mentioned.
My thought with it is that the employee really could take it and do as much with it as they individually chose to, whether they, you know, to dial in, but the organization would just be focused. The organization would still realize the benefit from that, from the employee that really dials in their sleep and is well rested and not suffering from any chronic fatigue, because we'd have happier, healthier workers, which is what we want. But yeah, the organization's not going to wade into that.
And then another one that I had is, and I might be messing my terms up, but he used the word countermeasures when he was talking about contacting employees and having them do jumping jacks or something else to you know, to prep themselves for this period where the schedule dictated that they may have fatigue. I mean, obviously you can't predict when calls are going to happen. I mean, within some reason, I mean, obviously there's an increase in calls at certain time frames. But, I mean, when we get a call, then you have that jolt from the tone alert, you have the getting on the truck and stuff like that. Doesn't that kind of fit with some of the physical triggers that they're mentioning as mitigation techniques?
Certainly could.
I thought it was promising. I think it looks like a decent program. So, I mean, I would certainly sign off on it and say I would be certainly willing to try it. And, you know, I think there's a few small things that maybe may need to be tweaked. You know, sounds like they're still working out the bugs for a schedule and a system like we run. But I think as a general concept, I think it looks pretty good to me.
Is there anything you need us to take back to the company to ask?
One of the questions that I had, I think he kind of alluded to it, was he alluded that there wasn't going to be any manual data entry. But let's say, you know, it's gonna pull our calls in. But
We hope.
We hope.
We're not certain that it can do that.
right. So let's say that it's optimal and it can pull our calls in, but it certainly isn't going to be able to pull in. Let's say we did, you know, a big training evolution and we worked really hard, or, you know, some other stressor that wasn't required, but maybe we had a hard workout that day, or we had a big training that required pretty stressful. I don't know how we could enter that, if that's manual, and then also how do we enter our own naps, or, you know, it's going to assume that we're going to be sleeping at night in between calls, but let's say you decide to take a nap at 12:30 for half an hour. Do we, the question I would ask them is, do we enter that? Is that something that we enter manually? Is that how, or do we just take a test and that validates?
He didn't touch on a lot on it in this presentation. In the first one, he focused a little more on like a survey type question, so that if like you were coming on shift, we could tailor the questions. So it could be, do you have scheduled training today? A yes, and then it may indicate, you know, how many hours or something at that time. It can be like a simple questionnaire. Those kind of questions we would want to think through and have your guys' input on those
Sure.
things that we would want to enter. But that may be the manual enter part where we confirm that there's going to be training and stuff.
And there's going to be things that we're going to discover as we go through this if we adopt this program, because obviously we're not, you know, it sounds like he's kind of steered toward industry. And so as he adapts the software and the programming to us, then things will change and adapt.
Us along with the policy to meet our needs.
Yeah, I would assume that, you know, this wouldn't be a thing where we make the decision to say, yeah, we're going to do that, go get it. We're going to be collaborating on how to build this with them, with their expert guidance, and then us saying, okay, well, what does that do for us, and how can we use this as a tool? You know, I think that we're all going to be intimately involved in that. The only other thing that I think, you know, is part of that, he talked about, I don't want to use the word countermeasures because he talked about their program countermeasures, but strategies to mitigate fatigue, you know. And those, you know, he talked about personal strategies and organizational strategies. And one organizational strategy that I can see is just the ability to move people either proactively or reactively to mitigate fatigue. And I think that that would be a powerful tool to have, not only to say, okay, crew A had a rough night last night on the first shift and they were up for 8 hours straight and now their PVD scores are above 12. And this is a pure speculation. I'm not even sure if I'm using the right terminology. But it would, instead of saying, okay, now and maybe we have staffing on, and we could say, okay, we can afford to put this unit, different people on this unit, because it's hard for us to completely take a unit out of the queue and just say, you know what, this is no longer a part of our response model. We just aren't that big to say, we're not going to have this engine or this ambulance as part of our response model for 4 hours. So that could mean that we would potentially have to call in overtime to relieve that crew for 4 hours. It would be beneficial to be able to either predict or proactively make a decision to say, look, we're going to do something different with staffing in order to preserve this crew, and then tomorrow we're going to do something different, with the idea that I really would not want any one person, as a rule, to work 48 hours on an ambulance. That's just an initial thought. Maybe we get to this and we look at PVD scores and we find out that that's not an issue. But if it is an issue, we'd like the ability to be able to proactively or reactively move people around in order to mitigate those fatigue stressors.
I think that, at least on some level, that's been, part of the conversation that we, from our side too, is at some level on that mitigation strategy, we might have to do exactly that. Whether it be moving people amongst individual rigs within a station, or moving stations entirely, just to reduce the call volume and the fatigue experience.
One interesting thing I kept bringing up is even a short 20-minute nap can really do quite a bit of good for.
He did make that statement once that he said, and I think he couched it this way, he said 2 + 2 really does equal 4. And he was talking about the need for sleep. And he said that, sometimes people say, oh, well, you shouldn't sleep for an hour in the middle of the day because then you'll be groggy and this. He said any sleep is good sleep. And that's where I think that we could look at this from a cultural perspective of how we allow our crews to manage their time. And we could really change the culture of how we look at fatigue. And so getting kind of to your point that even a 20-minute does help, and it contributes to reducing that sleep debt. So.
Well, and that's a piece of input that we've gotten from people that are on 48. On 48s is that a lot of times the department will move to an hour-and-a-half lunch to facilitate a little bit of that and to allow people to try to get a little bit more downtime during midday.
Sure. I have talked to finance a little bit about what, I got to admit it was not an in-depth conversation, but it sounds like moving on the first day of a payday is the best for them. They did say they are flexible. And then Christy in previous meeting had talked about the middle shift of anybody's go-round is really the best day to move. I know you guys were talking about an October 1st implementation date. I actually think it would be valuable to try to implement fatigue risk management system on October 1st and possibly look at a January 1st implementation date for 4896 to get us through the holidays. I'm not sure if your individuals have concerns with the holidays. Give finance some time to close out the end of the year, the fiscal year, and then focus on this implementation. So do you have any thoughts on that?
So January 1st is the beginning of a pay period? And
actually, no, January 1st is not. I had originally thought that January 3rd made sense. That's a middle shift for C platoon, but it is not necessarily the middle shift of a pay period. When we look at middle shifts of pay periods, January 15th is actually one. It's the middle shift of A platoon, and it is a first day of a pay period. And then there was, I think, one in December, but that would put the change like right the week before Christmas, possibly. I think the 18th might be the first day of a pay period, but it doesn't necessarily coincide with a middle shift. I'd have to look at the schedule a little closer. There is, as Christy mentioned last month, some FLSA consideration as far as premium hours. We think that liability is somewhere around $10,000. And so we would like to try to target one of those middle shifts, because as you mentioned last meeting, we want this to be as effective and efficient as possible. And it looks like that.
I think as far as that FLSA liability goes, in these meetings and in negotiations, I think we tried to be very clear that we wanted to minimize that. We don't want to be a burden financially moved to this schedule.
I think if we could make it so all the stars aligned and it fit with a middle shift and made it easier for finance the first part of a period, I think that's what we should shoot for. I mean, we really are trying to make this as easy as possible for everybody. So if January 15th, if that's where both things line up, what do you
So
guys
I'm going to
think?
look at possible dates that coincide with a middle shift that begin on a pay period. And I'll report back. It sounds to me like you are at least interested conceptually in this company specifically's PVT program. No red flags. I mean, but we're going to kind of move forward with looking at what this implementation would look like, maybe?
Yeah, I'm for it.
I think as long as it sticks to the approach that they presented, and we've tried to make clear that we take a program like that, implement it with the purpose of it guiding our decisions, and we use it to preemptively mitigate the risk, or reactively if we need to, in positive ways for employees, making sure they get time to maybe take a nap or take a break and get a cup of coffee, and that whatever we do does not go down any kind of punitive road.
I think that's the good thing about this company is in the initial presentation and this one, we really focused on that when they write the policy, they make sure that there are not punitive policies written in, so that it encourages people to use the tool, because otherwise you'll have less participation if they were to have those kind of consequences. So they design it that way so that people want to use the software.
And it sounds like you understand and agree that part of those strategies could be assigning people to apparatus either proactively or reactively, and possibly even station to station as a tool to mitigate fatigue.
I believe that this committee certainly agrees.
I'm okay with that.
Ask each of these guys.
Yeah, I think I was under the impression that was already part of what was in Scott's implementation plan.
I believe it was. I just wanted to be clear that since we're not directly referencing that manual, although that we did have that kind of conversation. So.
And of course, obviously all this has to be approved by the body and
Sure.
the city, but I think that the four of us are definitely on that page, and I believe that the majority of our membership is also on that page.
My last question kind of gets to what Eric had mentioned, and then I'd like to hear what you guys think would be the next steps and what you'd like to see. How do we go about quantifying kind of that concept that Eric brought up, that we may encounter a concern? I'll pull one of the metrics out of here, and I'm not necessarily saying this is going to be an issue, but let's just say sick leave use. Let's say we see a concerning trend in sick leave use. How do we come together and say, okay, the department says, hey, we're seeing an X rise in sick leave use. We think it could be schedule related. How do we ensure that we come together, deal with it, and have a solution that is acceptable to both parties?
think that's one of the components that would come up in labor management. I mean, if you guys did see a trend like that, I would hope you'd bring it there and that we'd have the ability to discuss it. You know, I also look at the converse of that. What happens if we see a reduction in sick leave use? I mean, hopefully you would be tracking that as well.
I think it would be reasonable to, you know, maybe stand up for a year after implementation, a committee that is composed of, you know, department management and, you know, labor, and that just maybe meets quarterly just to review some of these things. And maybe not with the intention of necessarily doing anything with the information, but to review it, digest it, and then share it with interested parties, you know.
Or
to
make
track
suggested
those-
policy
maybe
changes.
Yeah, suggestions. And just make that part of the implementation. Say we're just gonna meet, and whether things are going great or going bad or neutral, we'll meet once a quarter and just kind of look at these things.
Much like
Maybe-
it's outlined in here.
Yeah, kind of like that, and if suggestions need to be made by that committee, they can be made, and then followed up on in labor management or SAG or whatever the appropriate form would be for that.
You think is that an effective, acceptable tool, the labor management model?
I think it's the appropriate tool, and I agree with Andy that is where we would be able to act on those.
You know, I do like a little bit of what Scott was saying there, though, because if you do have a regular, say a quarterly meeting, and you look at that as a group, it acts as a little bit of a filter going into labor management, and then things don't end up being as reactive.
You might pick up on something before we notice it being a problem too. If we do have quarterly meetings like that, where just a select group reviews some data and kind of comes up with any trends that we might be seeing.
Is there a way what if we don't both agree that it's a problem? Say the example of sick leave, what if we see an increase of 10%? And I'm just, again, picking numbers, and I come to labor management, I say, you know, we're seeing a large increase in sick leave. We think it might be related to the schedule. How can we ensure that we have, and by the same token, if the union comes forward and says, hey, we see this, and that both sides say, that I don't just put it off and say, well, I don't think that's a problem, or it's not affecting me, so it's not a problem, or, you know, I just want to make sure that we're able to have a good, earnest dialogue and work on problems. I think we can.
So I would say that where Scott was talking about with the quarterly meetings, I think that helps a little bit with recency bias, because, I mean, it's pretty easy to go, 5 people called in sick on this day, and that suddenly be an issue.
Sure.
where it may be over the term of the quarter really wasn't.
Right.
And so if you do that and you have those regular meetings, then you're able to look at that time frame as a whole. And I think that the more data, I hate to say it, but the more time that's there, I think that some of that stuff just levels out, and then you do really know whether it's a trend or whether it's just something that you saw.
Right, an outlier.
Yeah.
I have a really hard time thinking of any way to really guarantee something like that, in the future. I think the best way to make sure that issues that either side has get addressed and dealt with seriousness by both sides too. The best way to make sure that happens 6 months from now or a year from now, I think, is not in any kind of policy that we write down, but more in maintaining this kind of a good, just working relationship and being able to be productive. That's what's going to guarantee that in the future.
So I kind of outlined a few things. I'm going to look at the middle shifts that coincide with the start of the pay period that could be a possible implementation date. We're in interested in an October 1 implementation of PVT work fit, to use that just in a global sense, with a implementation date closer to the beginning of the year for the 4896. We talked about kind of as long as it's in line with what he said about kind of that non-punitive reporting and that person still making the decisions and stuff, not a rigid algorithm.
And I guess along those lines too, and like Shane has said a few times, that decision-making can come at multiple levels.
Right.
And not just maybe, not only from the top, but that the captain can make a decision, and if the captain can't make the decision, the battalion chief can make the decision and work up from there.
I agree, and I think it goes kind of to what he said with the shared responsibility. The decisions could be made all the way from just the individual employee to the captain, to the BC, to the admin contact. And they all play a role in implementing the personal and the organizational countermeasures, mitigation strategies.
And I think if applied well, that kind of flexible strategy could work really well for us.
What would you like to see moving forward as our next steps? You talked about kind of formulating the skeleton of a policy document.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to know if what we have in the manual that we started with is a reasonable set of strategies to build around, and then where do we bring in maybe this PVT test? Where do we bring in what are any other factors that might play into it, and try to maybe start getting it all onto one sheet of paper.
Okay.
Is my real goal.
So kind of almost like an outline of this is going to happen on this date, we're going to do this, we're going to change this policy, kind of like an action items list of what we're going to do.
That would be good, and then also just to start really building, maybe not the fatigue policy itself, because that may be an SOG committee sort of thing, but building the requirements for the policy. And we've got a lot of ideas and a lot of things that I think are going to go into it, and it sounds like these people may be able to help us build that as well, but I just really like to see something kind of concrete that we have on a sheet of paper that says, this is roughly what our policy is going to look like. We've had several different things like this and other topics that have been brought up, and they all are going to fit together, but they haven't been, the puzzle hasn't been put together yet.
To me, a big component is kind of seeing what they bring to the table as far as their risk management system with this sample of those policies that they talked about. And I don't know in what time frame we get to start viewing those, whether they, as he said, are templates. And I would assume, based on his statement about firefighters are all humans as well, that the strategies for us are not going to be that different from ExxonMobil, from Air Canada, maybe with minor tweaks. And so I'll look into the timeline of when we can start getting some looks at those.
Okay. Yeah, and if we're gonna build off of their templates.
And obviously, we would need some assurance that you guys are okay moving towards this. I don't know that they're going to show us their policies until we make some sort of commitment to them, financial or otherwise, contractual, I guess. And so we would want to feel certain that you guys were willing to move forward on that before we made that outlay. I don't know if today's too soon to have that question, or maybe we should come back to the next question, or excuse me, next meeting and say, yeah, this is what we're going to do. I apologize that we're 10 minutes from drop dead, but
I think that it's something that we're definitely, that there's some interest on this side on, but I think we'd want a little bit more feedback from our membership. And so I think it would be best addressed in the next meeting.
Would any of the other members, would would there be any value in sharing this presentation?
They
Well,
have
yeah, they
access
can
to it.
watch, there's people live streaming right now.
Yeah, it'll be on the YouTube channel.
If we could maybe encourage that so you guys could get input in
Mhm.
this meeting, then. Upcoming, please.
I guess before we run out of time here, I'm just curious on your perspective on, the purpose of this particular committee and kind of, I guess, working out, let's say, the finer points of implementing 48. Do you feel like we need to go through we need to have a complete policy written down before this committee can be adjourned for the last time? Or can we come to a agreement of a structure and say, we're going to use, if we can make it work, we'll use a PVT program. We may not keep it forever. We may keep it forever. We may change programs. We may alter our policy in the future to meet, things that come up. I guess I'm just trying to figure out how much work is ahead of this particular committee versus how much work could just be done at the department level and getting the really fine points figured out, maybe at SOG level or labor management level.
I guess I kind of feel like, so I read the TA and I talked to Jared, and we feel like what we're doing in here, I think the language, and I didn't bring the copy, you may have it. I think it said it will be a policy document that will be referenced by MOU or something like that. Will be defined in a policy document which will be incorporated by reference into, so to me that means they're going to reference, let's just say SOG, because we do have some SOGs referenced in our CBA. To me, that would be one or several SOGs. That might be the fatigue policy, it might be the frequency of testing, PVT testing, and we wouldn't necessarily have to have all those details as long as we agreed that we were going to kind of push the I believe button and say we're going to let these people tell us when we're going to do it, and then we're going to meet with labor management and identify and deal with any problems. If they say, we want your people to take this every 15 minutes, then obviously labor is going to come to the next labor management meeting and say, we've identified a problem and we need to find a workable solution. And so I feel like we could have a pretty good skeleton of that policy done, but I don't, and I guess where I'm going to this, and I apologize, is that I don't think we have to have all those details done in order to ratify the current contract that's coming up, the new one, because we're still going to have to go back and add that language into the new contract, the FY22 contract that says basically in the regular work week, Article 8, it's going to refer to SOG, XYZ, and maybe others. Is that kind of your thought? I don't think there's...
I think we can put some real rough framework in the CBA. I think we can say that we've got, that this is our schedule, which it is already in there and shows our current schedule, and that then when we, that when we form the policy document, we will move to the 4896 and just have that rough framework in the contract. I mean, and the TA that we've signed says we're going to build an implementation plan, so really say we decided to adopt what Scott's already provided, then what we would do is just do an MOU that would reference that, and then I don't think we would make further changes to the CBA because we would have already covered our bases as far as this is the schedule we're moving to, and that's already memorialized in the contract. So I think we can ratify the contract as is, but if we need to do this stuff on an MOU and say this is the policy document, this is the MOU, then I think we'd have to pass that at a later date.
Right, and part of that MOU probably is going to detail some of the FLSA schedules, et cetera, that are delineated in the contract. So there will be a few contract
Well, in the
changes.
FLSA schedule, other than the date that it starts on, I mean, it's already defined in the contract, and really, I think that to move to this, all we'd have to say is that we move to an 18-day FLSA cycle
Right.
that meets this criteria.
Yeah, I agree. But it still would affect current contract.
Yeah, no, but I think we could put that language in now without having the details other than the start, with having the details other than the start date.
Okay.
I have a question along those lines too, because like existing policies, obviously this would change our vacation bidding policy. I guess I don't view it as this committee's job to worry about that. I think we can provide the rough framework, but I would like to see it go to SOG and the SOG committee, iron out those details and then bring it back and make sure that it fits with what's intended here. But that would be really similar to a few years ago when we changed our Kelly Day policy, and basically we negotiated it, but the SOG committee took care of the work as far as the SOG that was
Just
referenced.
The SOG, I think, right?
Yeah. And I don't think even that involves changes in the CBA, because the vacation bidding policy is going to have the same SOG number
Right.
regardless. It would just be, updating that SOG.
Any other closing thoughts on what we need to do before?
I guess, before we run out of all of our time. So there's been a whole bunch of other topics kind of thrown around the last two meetings. And we haven't really discussed any of them except for the fatigue policy in particular, and how to implement a PVT into it. Is that where we're at with this? Or is that kind of the meat of this problem?
This is really where I think we're going, is PVT work fit, the ability to move people around to proactively or reactively mitigate fatigue, and we will come together, and this is very broad, and agree that if either side realizes a concern with the schedule or with fatigue, that we will work together to address those.
And so the other concerns that were brought up the last few meetings, we can maybe say are no longer concerns.
I believe that
this committee.
I believe that the PVT work fit is going to be where we're going to reveal any issues, and I have faith that some of those other things that may be perceived concerns, in my estimation, maybe aren't.
Okay. I just want to make sure we figure out our focus.
Like we said before, we're not worried about changing trade policies, we're not worried about residency requirements.
That's not my focus here. My focus
Perfect.
is getting us to 4896 by implementing PVT work fit and having some of those strategies.
Sounds great.
I think we can work with that for sure.
Okay, awesome. I don't have the schedule for this room, and so we'll reach out to you to schedule the next meeting.
Okay.
Maybe even the last. We'll see.
That'd be cool.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.